Thank you very much for the invitation to address the audience today, and I hope everyone can hear me better than you can see me.
We can hear you very well.
Good, because I was worried that otherwise I was going to have to tweet all of my messages. But for those of you who are active tweeters, then do feel free to follow what's going on down here on Twitter. But let me just make a couple of points. I mean, first of all, I thought that this was an exciting opportunity to have a bit of a discussion and a debate about what's happening in South Sudan. I think I've just come from the annual retreat of humanitarian coordinators and of the Deputy Special Representative that took place in Switzerland last week. And I thought it was quite interesting because when I was asking people, you know, what image does it conjure up in your mind when somebody mentions the word South Sudan, the response that I got was probably not unlike the response that I would get if I were to ask that question of the audience right now. Overwhelmingly, what I heard from people in the United Nations Secretariat was, well, it's a very difficult place, disaster, hostilities, troubles, squabbles with Sudan, access, humanitarian, emergency, all these sorts of words. And I think that the message that I'd like to get across today is that actually I think the picture of what's happening in South Sudan is far more nuanced. I think it's far more diverse and it's far more exciting. I had the chance over the last few years before I came to South Sudan to work in a country called East Timor. And let me just mention that 10 years ago, when that country became independent, it had staggering illiteracy rates. Staggering rates of illiteracy. It had staggering rates of malnutrition, terrible rates of poverty, no government institutions, no national parliament, and a fairly disastrous relationship with its biggest neighbor. That was 10 years ago. Now, last year, in 2012, 10 years after independence in East Timor, I was part of the UN team that closed the peacekeeping mission and that brought the humanitarian program to what was widely regarded as a successful conclusion. And East Timor today is often cited as an example. It's often cited as a good example, but it's cited as an example of how a new state can get up on its own feet. And what I've been struck by here in South Sudan is the remarkable number of parallels between the situation in East Timor in 2002 and in South Sudan today. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that when we go about our day-to-day work, our week-to-week engagements, our month-to-month planning, that we have a destination. And for me, the destination is, you know, what can we as an international community achieve with the people of South Sudan, for the people of South Sudan, and under the guidance and leadership and ownership of the state here, what can we achieve over the next few years, let's say a decade? Can we bring to a successful conclusion the international community's peace and security engagement? Can we bring to an end this constant cycle of consolidated appeals, of humanitarian appeals, of emergency this and emergency that? Well, my answer to that question is yes, we can. But it'll take all of us working together, no matter which part of the international system or which part of the government of South Sudan or the institutions of South Sudan that we're working within. So I think that one of the interesting things about my particular role here, and I feel pretty lucky to have it, is that I'm in the peacekeeping mission. I'm at the same time the humanitarian coordinator, and at the same time I'm overseeing the development work of the United Nations system here. That's the resident coordinator hat that I'm expected to wear. So what I tried to do in my article was really give an example using food security of how we can, over time, and we should and we really must, focus on how to extract all of us from this humanitarian dilemma where it's just program after program after program, as opposed to actually empowering communities, empowering the country, and focusing on a much more long-term and long-standing approach that will actually help pull South Sudan up from its current situation. I think that I want to be very clear about one thing. I am not a believer in this T word. It's not T for Toby, it's T for transition. I'm not a believer in discussions about the transition in a setting such as South Sudan. I do talk quite a lot about the parallel tracks of humanitarian action and development cooperation, and I'm very interested in having a close link between those parallel tracks, because I think that no matter where you are, no matter whether it's a city or a rural setting in South Sudan, it would be very easy to find humanitarian need. It would be very easy to program a response as a humanitarian response, or to couch things with or through a development lens. And so I think that talking about both humanitarian action and development cooperation here is important. It's a challenge because, as we know, getting development financing, getting support from the donor community, in particular for the NGOs who are interested in working in the development stream, getting institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund engaged in a collaborative manner with the broader international community on issues of development, that is a much longer process than it is to mount a humanitarian response or to gain access to humanitarian financing. And I think in that sense, that is one of the reasons why the consolidated appeal here, I would call it humanitarian plus for want of a better term. I think it's important to recognize that it's not only putting forth life-saving actions or programs, it is certainly addressing a broader range of engagement, whether it's on food security or education or health programs. And I think that that's the right approach, because it enables us to try to gain some access to humanitarian financing to help further long-term thinking and the development aspirations of communities and of South Sudan. That said, at the same time, I don't want to rely on humanitarian financing. And there's one thing that I'm very concerned about. When you look at the proportions of ODA coming into South Sudan, it paints a very worrying picture. 56% of all ODA coming into South Sudan is earmarked as humanitarian financing. That percentage is far, far higher than it would be, or than it is, in a setting such as Somalia, Afghanistan, or other states, which I think are often called fragile, or even in the case of Somalia until recently, a failed state setting. So I think that the proportion of ODA that we're seeing in South Sudan, I think it would be useful if it's not that we're looking for a shift, but we're certainly looking for more development monies and easier to access development monies to be made available both to NGOs, UN agencies, and others. And I've written about this recently in countries such as Sweden, where I think that there's a strong history and experience of solidarity with the poorest of the poor and lifting the poorest of the poor out of their poverty trap. Let me just make one other point, and then I think you will have heard more than enough from me. Working in South Sudan is no easy topic, and I certainly don't want to promote it as such. But this is a place where things are happening, where things can happen, and where I believe the international community has a very exciting opportunity to work with the people and the institutions of South Sudan. we are welcome here. We are invited to come and work here, and we are largely enabled to participate in important national and regional and local mechanisms. We are given pretty good access throughout the 79 counties of the country, throughout the 79 counties of the 10 states. But it's not without difficulty, and I would be remiss to not to mention that. And it's highlighted in HPN's issue, which you're putting out today on South Sudan. I think it's very important that all of the different NGOs, donor community, the UN agencies, that they continue to feel welcomed to work in South Sudan, and that the work is continuously facilitated, and that regardless of whether we're working in a tough place like Pibor County, which is probably the most troubled and persistently challenged part of the country, whether we're working there or whether we're working in a state such as Western Equatoria, where there are completely different sets of challenges, very much of a development nature, that we are consistently welcomed and that our work is facilitated. And I think that in return, what's very important is that we, as members of the international community, really pledge and commit to working hand in hand with people, with the communities, and with the institutions of South Sudan to help this country move forward, so that with a bit of hard work and discipline and good planning, I think that there's every chance that within 10 years you could have another issue of humanitarian exchange in which we look back and say, once again, the people of a new state have been supported by the international community, and they've managed to move beyond peacekeeping and humanitarian action. And the real focus of the day is on the key development issues and the economic challenges that will face South Sudan for many, many years to come. So I think there's every chance that we can have we are having, and we will continue to have, a very lively exchange about work in South Sudan. I'd like to encourage all of you sitting up in grey and dreary and breezy London, or wherever you may be sitting right now, to come down here and join us, because frankly there's no better place to be working, and I think that all of us are committed to the work that we're doing here on the ground. And I'll leave it at that and hand over to some of my colleagues here, and if there are questions or comments later, very happy to address them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby, and thank you really for your remarks, and particularly for your emphasis on the parallel track. That resonates strongly with what we've been saying at HPG for a long time about, we call it the shared space between humanitarian and development actors in South Sudan. But the reality is, as you've said, what we've been witnessing since the CPA has been the pendulum swing, all the way to development, a bit too early and too fast, and now all the way to humanitarian. And yes, we very much hope that we can have a more balanced approach going forward. But yeah, I'd like to invite Dr. Jock Madut Jock to now address the audience. Jock is the Executive Director of the Sud Institute, but he's also the Undersecretary in the Ministry of Culture and Heritage in the government of South Sudan. Prior to returning to South Sudan, Jock was a Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace and also a Fellow at the Rift Valley Institute. But he's also been a humanitarian aid worker, a consultant, and an author, notably of a book entitled Sudan, Race, Religion and Violence. Jock, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours.